Good morning, welcome everyone. My name is Marcelo. I'm an artist. I'm based in London in the UK, and I work with St. Christopher's Hospice, which is a large hospice in South London. And this presentation is called Facing Death Creatively. 4,000 years ago, Gilgamesh, in the earliest human recorded stories, says, "Thou hast become dark and cannot hear me. When I die, shall I not be like Enkidu? Sorrow enters my heart. I am afraid of death." This presentation will show how our interventions with people who are at the end of their life under hospice care can create an alternative language with which to discuss the fear of death. This practice's research comes from my experience as a social practice artist working for St. Christopher's Hospice in South London. I'm part of a larger arts team that has art therapists, music therapists, and drama therapists. And the work that we do there is a type of communication around the fear and anxiety of death and dying. The fear of death is an unknown that is combined with a lack of concrete evidence of what happens after death. And we have very few rituals that let us deal with the dying process. So we enter into the dying process without any tools to prepare us for what it means to die. During this period of dying, there's a period of transition of evaluation, of assessment, and potentially of creative development. Because when you realize that you're about to die, all of the blockages that you might feel begin to open because nothing really matters anymore. So those things that you hold begin opening up, and that is a process that I work in Death and Dying in the Arts. Cultural anthropologist Ernst Beckers calls this a paradox, for the fear of death is necessary for the organism to function and be armed towards self-preservation, but we maintain a total oblivious about this fear in our everyday life. We don't really engage with it. We know we're going to die, but it's far away and we don't think about it. Death is the one certainty that we have about living. It's the one thing that we know that we have about living. Although having an awareness that death is imminent, that it's going to come very soon, that is only when we begin to change our perspective. The imminence of death remains for the most part a really distant reality. We become designated as dying when biomedically we're told that death is imminent. So this is a consciousness shift, one where engagement with life takes on a much bigger importance. So dying is understood as the immediate period of time when we're approaching death, when we have that awareness, and when death is inevitable and it's unavoidably close, our perception of time changes, and it affects our management of daily activities, which take on a new importance. Here we're seeing some images of self-portraiture done in clay with some patients. On the left was some patients that wanted to work on aspects of his spine that he was losing control of in his self-portraiture. On the right was a patient who was a kidney surgeon expert, and he had advanced Parkinson and he couldn't really move much anymore, and what he wanted to portray were these elements of organs in his self-portrait. Most people want to die at home. They don't want to die in a hospital bed. But as society, if we don't talk about death, how are we equipped to take care of people when they want to die at home? Currently, the UK, the largest group of people are 65 and over. So the baby boomers are now reaching the end of their life. The post-war generation are reaching the end of their life, which means every year there's a 20 to 25% increase in the amount of people who need hospice care. Hospice is a place that's just for people who are dying. It's not for people who are ill. It's just for people who are dying. So there's not enough institutional space to take care of all of the people. It's a tidal wave of death. How can we discuss death and dying and alleviate the cultural fear of death that's gripped us since that epic poem of Gilgamesh 4,000 years ago? Perhaps that poem itself is an example of being able to name the fear, and potentially through the arts and naming fear, we allow people to understand its existence. So we offer lots of types of art projects at the hospice, and this enables the patient to become an active member in the management of their death process. The creation of a work of art is a collaborative endeavor. It's completed in tandem with a trained artist, and the results demonstrate the hands-on labor of the patient. Producing an expressive form of art at the end of your life is not done to the patients, it's done with the patients. Music therapist and hospice chair Nigel Chartley recognizes that the end of life is about engaging in a time of dying by, quote, living life to the fullest. If you live that life to the fullest, that life will include the arts. So how does engagement with the arts both empower the patient and give them space to confront fear? I'm going to examine this question through a few case studies, but before I do, I'm going to contextualize what it means to have an aesthetic encounter in relation to the end of life. So, art historian and critic Clement Greenberg offers a useful approach to understanding the impact of arts at the end of life. According to Greenberg, anything that can be experienced at all can be experienced aesthetically, and that anything can be experienced aesthetically can also be experienced as art. In short, art and aesthetics don't just overlap, they coincide. So Greenberg here is equating art making with aesthetic appreciation, and it also elevates the practice of everyday life to art making. This is central to arts integration in the end-of-life care, as most patients who engage in the arts have no formal training. Most people come into making art saying, I can't do that, I don't know how, that's not for me, I've never done it, I'm not good, I'm bad. This is the first thinking. This is the thinking we all carry throughout our whole life. This is a period of time where we open up that thinking into something different, because creating a work of art at the end of your life is not about being good. It's about the process of thinking critically and creatively. The creative act of art making becomes a formula for mental distancing that allows a refocusing of complex processes. From this perspective, participating in an arts project is not about skill, but about modes of perception. Much how I spent my time yesterday, at the end of the day, I went to the Hermitage, I looked at many of the things in the Hermitage, they're objects of art. There's an objective distancing. I'm not necessarily going to make it, I'm going to understand it from an objective point of view. When you work in the arts, this is what you do with your fear about death. You begin putting it out there so you can understand it. So, enter death anxiety. Death anxiety is the feeling of dread and fear, and that death is looming. Death anxiety can be considered the mother of all religions. Religions which exist in part to help us calm our idea of a finite existence. The God concept helps us soften this finite existence with the promise of an afterlife. But as existential psychiatrist Irving Yalom says, there can also be the other side. Death awareness can offer a period of time of self-realization and a catalyst for deep life changes. St. Augustine said, "It is only in the face of death that a person's self is born." All of the daily things that fill our existence lose importance in the face of death, and the need to connect to the true core self before dying takes precedence. Yalom expands on this. Quote, "The physicality of death destroys us. The idea of death saves us." Sociologist Alan Kelleher defined dying as a self-conscious anticipation of impending death and the social alterations of one lifestyle, prompted by ourselves and others that are based on that awareness. He expands on this definition of death past an awareness of imminent death as a solitary act confined to the individual. We all die alone, no matter what. It is a solitary act. You might have people around you, but it is the one grand gesture you do completely by yourself. Dying engages a wide range of social relations: family, friends, doctors, nurses, therapists, other professions. So you are the protagonist in this big theater of death and dying. My work as a social practice artist comes into play exactly at this moment, between the past priorities and the new realities. This engagement with the arts practice means for patients an amount of risk-taking, touching on notions of skill, virtuosity, purpose, legacy. From my time as an artist working around death and dying, I recognize how participating in the arts provides the dying individual with a perspective on their situation, a space which wish to understand and live with fear, as they attempt to unravel the implications of this new consciousness of life. The arts interventions at St. Christopher's help define the relationship with death anxiety and offer communication that's non-verbal. And this is a very important part. Many patients who are dying can't speak. Or if you need to speak about your death, you can't use words. So engaging in music and art is a way to speak about death without language. It's a very important language. It's a language that we all subscribe to, we all appreciate culturally, but when we have to do it, that's the bigger jump. That's the jump that happens at the end of the life, and that's the work that I work in and that I'm presenting. St. Christopher's was established in 1967 by Dame Cecily Saunders, and it cares for thousands of dying people every year in South London. It's considered one of the spearheads of the modern hospice movement. Before the hospice, you died in the hospital, but the hospital is for treating and making you better. A hospice will not make you better. A hospice manages your illness and allows you to die. The work is carried out primarily in the community through home visits. There's also 4 patient wards, so that means that most people are home. So they come to the hospice and they have various different kind of therapies. They could be psychosocial therapies, they could be biomedical appointments, and then they go home. There's a few people that stay in the rooms upstairs at the hospice, but they're there for a very short period of time, no more than 2 weeks. Either they die or they go home again. So we are creating something that's a new social program, and the new social program is about going out and creating works in the community. So being able to create artworks that help communities talk about death and dying so that communities can take care of themselves. Oh, that's interesting. Sadly, that won't play. Oh well, it's a great video, but sadly it's not playing. So I'm going to lose some of the interactive media of my presentation, so apologies for that. So the process and production of art making at end of life creates a space where individuals mentally remove themselves from the state of dying and employ a different pattern of critical thinking. This distances allows for more acceptance of the idea of death when viewed through the creative metaphors of art. It's this exact distancing that allows the individual to become co-creative participants in the management of their death and not passive victims to it. When you enter into the death process, you're very managed. So you're managed by all of these people and they push you through a system. When you go and you start making your own artworks, you are the manager and you are the owner. And so there is a kind of autonomy and a power in that you can claim your death. You can claim your dying. I work with the patients from a variety of faiths, creeds, races, lifestyles, and they all arrive at this moment of reassessing their life when faced with imminent death. It produces a need to participate creatively in the development of a tangible work of art that can serve to overcome fears, to confront new challenges, to be awarded with new successes, and finally feel somehow more prepared for death. Many people arrive at the end of their life feeling that the effort that they've had in their life and the suffering was worth nothing. They reflect upon their past and they see a void. And this is very common. The changing structures and technological production in our global socioeconomic system mean that a lifetime of work can leave an individual with very little material objects that are personal enough for them to be viewed as a continuation of their life after their death. This is legacy. What do we leave when we're dead? What is the object that we leave? Most people arrive at the end, no matter how successful and professional they are, and look at the material cultural objects that they have and see nothing and feel a void. So suddenly, people like that surgeon, who was a very successful published surgeon, his house is full of artworks that he made in the last moments of his life. This became what he became proud of. This became the material object he could leave behind to make a statement saying, I was once here. The objects of music, ceramics, painting, performances, creating at the end of life become important legacies. They fill the void of the archive. I'm going to talk about 2 case studies now to kind of contextualize this a bit more. I'm slightly disappointed my videos don't play. So we understand the world through images. As human beings, we know our bodies and our minds through what we can imagine. To begin to comprehend our humanity, we need to structure these images and metaphors into models. So I work with two people, a music therapist and an art therapist, among others who I interviewed. Tamsin Dives is a music therapist and a professional opera singer. And we talked about how music plays a role in death anxiety and fear of dying. According to Tamsin, the core of music improvisation is it's possible to play pain and fear and experience it viscerally, even though it's not named or talked about. Music becomes a containable way of emotionally going to the limits or the edges that maybe you can't personally. In other art forms, there might be boundaries, like in visual arts, but in music, the sound goes in the air and then it's gone. It also becomes an embodied physical experience. There's the heartbeat, there's the blood flow, there's the breathing. Dives worked with one patient, a young mother who was upset about leaving her child behind. She began playing large, angry sounds. She wanted to chant, to shout, to stomp. She began tearing at herself, experiencing the abyss. And then she returned to calm. The therapist played soft, repeating melodies with her until she was finally able to recognize her distress and, in essence, exercise it through the art form. Fear is a relationship. How do you live with it? How can you see it differently? It's not about overcoming fear. It's about living with fear. The tendency to feel fear when confronted with death is an inner attempt to resolve the impossible. For art therapist Maria Mota, the materiality of visual arts is the opposite. You create an archive. You can place that fear and that anxiety down, and you can live with it. You can look at it. You can have a relationship with it. Also, you can revisit that because as time passes, you may feel a different kind of fear and anxiety in your dying process, and you can go back and look at the artworks and understand how that may have changed. She spoke of a patient. He was obsessed with the story of King Canute. King Canute was a proud king who wanted to show his power by placing his throne on the tide. And he was going to show his power by telling the sea, "You won't come." Of course, what happened? The sea just overtook him. He was talking about his own death. In this, we start understanding how making these artworks and being able to comprehend your death and dying, we talk metaphorically. I'm almost done. What we see in the arts is that around fear and death, there's also fear of oblivion. Will anyone remember you? What will happen when you are no longer here? Life and time will carry on. And the most we can do is plan and imagine our own funerals. What a shame to miss your own funeral. Perhaps it's better to have a farewell party while you're still alive, but for the most part, we deny death until the very last minute. Even the Buddha taught, at the base of all things, all beings experience a state of anxiety fed by our habit of resisting the impermanence of our existence. We live by a medieval model of death avoidance where doctors are trained to fix the misbehaving body. That doctor also feels death anxiety. The hospice is not about curing, it's about alleviating this fear of death. So this presentation is sought to demonstrate how engagement in the arts and end-of-life care aids in abating death anxiety in the process of dying. The fear of death can be understood in existential terms as the problem of finding meaning in one's life. The difference between knowing you may die and knowing that death is imminent. Since death is unknown, what's feared is a collection of the known that's superimposed upon death. So I'll end with a quote by François de la Rochefoucauld. You cannot stare straight into the sun or death. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we have time. Questions, comments, please. Yes, please.
Trying to speak in English, thank you very much for the presentation. How long do you work as an art therapist? And I'm interested, does the cultural context of this Нет, лучше по-русски.
У нас переводят или какая тут вообще система?
Should I listen to the translation?
Микрофон.
Я не знаю.
Только микрофон.
То есть вам переводят?
Да,
Микрофон,
переводят.
да. Ну тогда, наверное, надо говорить в микрофон. Да, пожалуйста.
Простите, пожалуйста, ну, как-то...
Ничего, все в порядке. Организуйте.
У меня такой вопрос. Слышно? Скажите, пожалуйста, как давно вы работаете в терапии искусством, в хосписе? И изменилось ли за это время, пока вы работали, то, как изображают свои страхи перед смертью пациенты хосписа? Поскольку вы просто сказали, что сейчас умирает поколение послевоенное, мне интересно посмотреть, как эти универсальные страхи контекстуализируются в конкретном культурном контексте, то есть как меняются эти универсальные страхи, какие они приобретают формы вот в этих рисунках, арт-объектах и так далее.
I can only hear part of that through this. Sorry, because I can only hear part of it through the translator.
What is the main dynamic of the fears images?
Yeah. So there's a few things that I think I can answer with that question. One thing that I need to make clear is that I'm not an art therapist. So I'm a community artist. So there's a difference. So what I do is I work with art as therapy. Because I work collaboratively and I work on group projects and I work on public projects. So art therapy is one-to-one and it's private and it's not really shared. So there's a big difference, number one. The other thing is that I am working in the cultural context of the UK, but I do think that kind of cultural context in terms of Europe in general is shared, how we, and human-wise is shared, how we are unable to speak about death and share death and be open about death because we fear death. This is why I start with the epic poem of Gilgamesh, which is 4,000 years old, because this is something that is inside all of us, although I'm working within that context. There could be, in terms of thinking about what's the output that people make, sometimes that output really is about the opposite of death. Generally, what people want to archive and represent and celebrate is a huge celebration of life. Nobody wants to live more than somebody who's about to die. So actually, often what you end up representing are celebratory moments. And those moments become a way of taking the best part of you or your experience and just putting it on something that you can then give to your family. So that becomes a lot of my experience working at the hospice. I'm sorry if that doesn't answer your question totally, but I could only hear half of it.
Okay. Пожалуйста, вопросы? Пожалуйста. Если по-русски, то подойти к микрофону, пожалуйста.
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed with your presentation and your work. And you used a strong metaphor about patient as a protagonist of process of dying. And I'd like to ask, what do you think, who is antagonist in this process? Fear, death? What do you think according your patients?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm really interested in mythology, and I've read some of Joseph Campbell, who was a mythologist that explored what he termed the hero's journey. I'm going to answer your question this way. In the hero's journey, the hero is the protagonist. The hero, in order to, and this is something that he understood looking at all myths. Myths are just ways to understand our life. The hero, in order to receive knowledge and understanding, needs to leave the everyday life and go somewhere. And in going somewhere, comes back. So he becomes that protagonist. In that journey, the hero is always faced with the beast. There's always some sort of beast. The beast here is the antagonist. With this presentation, absolutely 100%, what we are dealing with in terms of the beast and the antagonist is a mixture of not only death anxiety, but death denial. So I work with people at the hospice who say to me, who are in a bed up in the rooms upstairs, and if you're in a bed, it means you're very close to death, and they say, oh, no, I'm going home soon. So the denial of death is huge. If they hear the death, it's not everybody, but most people, if they hear the death word, they don't want to hear it. So when you say to someone, living life to you live your life to the fullest, live until the last moment, that's death denial. Actually, the antagonist is somebody who you need to have almost as your lover, as the closest person to you. That's the fear. And that's not overcoming fear, that's living with fear, understanding fear, and being a part of fear.
Пожалуйста, could I ask you something?
Yeah.
Maybe? Could you give, please, a little bit of history, when it appeared and what was the story in Great Britain? Where the idea come from to go with this community and art service to hospice? And when?
Okay, well, arts in general, the hospice movement was created in the late 60s, and that was something that Dame Cecily Stonder started. She was a nurse in a hospital, and she was working with a Polish refugee from the war, and he was dying. And he was unhappy dying in the hospital. And she had nursed many people to death, and she said, there needs to be a home. She thought of it as a home, not as a hospital. There needs to be a home where people who are dying can come to. And she termed it to take care of the total care of death. And total care of death meant not just your body, but also your mind and your spirit. And that began the idea of the hospice. Nigel Hartley, who used to be the chair at St. Christopher's Hospice, was a music therapist who started the arts team at the hospice. He was the one who thought that instead of having individuals that just do one-to-one work with patients, you can have a larger team that does larger projects that also include the community. So that team started maybe 15 years ago. There are different hospice teams. They're all very small. St. Christopher's has the largest one. I will say that it is just like anywhere in the arts, the funding has actually gotten smaller. So the team has gotten smaller. So the whole, which grew a lot over 10 years, is now shrunk. But this is the nature of funding and the arts and the world we live in. So that this is kind of another sideline story. But it sort of grew internally. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Еще, пожалуйста, у нас есть время на один вопрос. Okay, thanks a lot.